Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision.
Right. It's almost like engineering.
Exactly. You fall, you break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points to the screen and says, well, there it is. That's the problem.
It is entirely binary. I mean, it's either broken or it's not. The intervention is obvious.
Yeah. Put a cast on it, it's clean. And honestly, it's comforting. We naturally like things to be visible, to be categorized easily, especially when we're trying to fix something.
But the moment you step out of the hospital and into the world of national economics or, public policy and human development, that comforting X-ray machine is completely useless.
It really is.
The diagnostic landscape we're looking at today is the absolute definition of murky waters.
Welcome to the deep dive. Whether you're an international investor prepping for a high-stakes strategy meeting, someone catching up on global macroeconomic trends, or you're just insanely curious about how societies actually function under the hood, this exploration is custom-tailored just for you.
We have a really fascinating mission today.
We do. We're analyzing a phenomenon we're calling Peru's growth paradox. And to do this, we've gathered a massive comprehensive stack of data. We're talking macroeconomic histories, public health records, education statistics, and governance metrics from the World Bank and the International Labor Organization.
And we are using all of that to answer a question that honestly just baffles the mind.
Because here is the hook, and this is the core paradox we're going to explore. If you look at the broad economic profile of Peru over the last few decades, you see this massive, sweeping upward trajectory. I mean, we're talking about GDP per capita essentially doubling.
The top-line economic indicators are absolutely dazzling. It truly defies the standard economic gravity that we're all taught to believe in during Economics 101.
Right. You look at the sheer wealth generation and assume this is a textbook development success story. But sitting right next to that soaring wealth is a quiet catastrophe. It's a huge, fractured, almost violently broken statistic, 44.4%.
And that number is perhaps the most critical metric for the country's actual future.
Over 44.4% of late primary age children in Peru lack basic reading skills. Let that sink in for a second. The economic metrics are blindingly bright, but they are hiding a severe human capital black hole. And that is the paradox we're unpacking today.
How does a country's wealth skyrocket? How does its infrastructure modernize while nearly half of its kids cannot read proficiently? I mean, where is all that money going?
And more importantly, what stole the future from these children?
To really map out the anatomy of this paradox, we have to deconstruct the developmental pipeline into 4 distinct phases. We can't just look at the current failure. We have to look at how we got here.
Okay, so what's the framework?
First, we have to examine the macroeconomic takeoff, so the boom itself. Second, we'll look at how that boom successfully improved basic survival metrics, what we might call the societal hardware.
The hardware, okay.
Right. Third, we confront the total disconnect with the educational software, which is where that 44.4% comes in. And finally, we trace it all back to the root cause, which is the decay of governance and institutional integrity that locks this severe inequality into place.
I want to start with that first phase, the macroeconomy. Because before we can diagnose the disease, we really have to acknowledge the sheer scale of the apparent cure.
We do.
We need to look at Peru's undeniable economic and infrastructural triumphs to establish the baseline of this paradox. Because if you just looked at the historical data, you'd think this country had completely solved the puzzle of modern development.
It is a remarkable growth story. If we trace the trajectory from 1960 to the 2020s, looking specifically at GDP per capita, the transformation is striking. And to be clear, when we look at these numbers, we're using constant 2015 dollars.
And we do that to strip away the noise of inflation and currency fluctuations. Okay.
Exactly. It gives us a true, normalized picture of actual purchasing power and economic expansion.
Because otherwise, a hyperinflation period could make it look like a country is getting wildly rich on paper while people are actually starving.
Yeah.
So in constant dollars, where did they start?
In 1960, the GDP per capita was hovering around $2,700.
Okay, $2,700.
Yeah, and it saw a slow, somewhat volatile climb for a few decades. But the real story, the aggressive upward explosion, happens between 2000 and 2015.
Wow, a 15-year window.
During that window, fueled by a massive global commodity boom, particularly in minerals like copper and silver, alongside the dividends of some structural economic reforms, that number skyrockets.
It just takes off.
It blows past its historical ceilings and reaches over $6,500.
That is a staggering injection of pure wealth into a national economy. in a very compressed time frame.
It fundamentally reshaped the national balance sheet. And we have to give credit where it's due, because that wealth generation wasn't just numbers on a central bank ledger. It actually saved lives on a massive
Oh,
scale.
wow. In what way?
The most dramatic evidence of this is in the public health data regarding infant and child mortality over that same period. This is a historical public health victory that really deserves recognition.
What were the mortality numbers like back in 1960?
In 1960, the infant mortality rate was a tragic 152 deaths per 1,000 live births.
Wait, pause on that number for a second. Let's really contextualize that. That means over 15% of all babies born were not surviving their first year of life.
It's hard to even fathom.
That is not just a statistic, that is a societal trauma. That means child death is a normalized, expected part of family planning. It touches almost every extended family, every neighborhood.
It dictates the entire psychology of a population. But if you fast forward to the recent data following this economic boom, that number has plummeted to roughly 13.5 deaths per 1,000 live birth.
That is a drop of over 90%.
A greater than 90% reduction in infant mortality. And the under 5 mortality rate mirrors this exact same cliff edge drop. The X-ray, to use your earlier analogy, looks absolutely phenomenal here. The intervention worked.
And it wasn't just healthcare access, right? The infrastructural rollout during this period was also massive.
Yeah, the government proved that it could successfully distribute physical resources when the funding was abundant. If you look at electrification, urban electricity access practically hit 100%.
Which is huge.
But more impressively, the rural electrification gap, which historically had been a massive chasm in Peru, closed with incredible speed. They laid the copper wire, they built the substations, they pushed the grid out into incredibly difficult Andean and Amazonian terrain.
So they proved they can actually build things.
They proved that the state has the logistical muscle to execute large-scale nationwide rollouts.
Okay, so let's unpack this. I'm looking at all this. The soaring GDP, the babies surviving past their first year, the lights literally turning on across the rural highlands. And I'm thinking about an analogy to help frame this.
Go for it.
It's like a country buying a state-of-the-art computer system. The government went in and they upgraded the power supply. They built a beautiful new casing. They installed top-of-the-line cooling fans. The physical hardware of the nation is pristine.
I like that. The hardware is fixed.
But, and here's my major pushback, if the hardware is completely fixed and the economy is flush with all this commodity cash, shouldn't the societal software, the people, their minds, their capabilities, automatically run better? Why doesn't wealth automatically equal human capability?
That is the million-dollar question for anyone studying development economics. And assuming the two are automatically linked represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how societies actually evolve.
How so? Because common sense says more money equals better schools, better people, better outcomes.
Because hardware problems and software problems require entirely different mechanisms of governance. Hardware problems, like laying thousands of miles of electrical lines, or purchasing millions of units of basic vaccines and driving them to rural clinics, those can be solved with pure capital and centralized brute force logistics.
Because it's a physical transaction.
Precisely. You throw enough money and engineering at a physical deficit, and you get a result. You get the lights on. You get the infant mortality down because the vaccines physically arrive.
You are buying a tangible thing and putting it in a specific place.
But software problems, like human cognitive development, pedagogical excellence, critical thinking, and institutional trust, those require complex, sustained, high-quality human interaction.
Which is much harder to just buy.
You cannot just buy a functioning education system off a shelf in Europe and drop it into a rural province in the Andes. It requires trained teachers who are motivated and respected. It requires engaged communities. It requires constantly evolving curriculum design.
And crucially, it requires an environment free of crushing daily poverty.
Right, and this introduces the core tension of the data we're examining. The state successfully built the hardware, but completely neglected the software.
Which logically brings us to the second phase of our analysis, the human capital black hole. We're transitioning from the glowing success of physical infrastructure directly into the failure of human infrastructure.
And for you listening to this is where the traditional economic narrative of growth fixes everything totally breaks down.
To quantify this breakdown, we're looking at something economists call the Human Capital Index, or the HCI.
Right. This is a metric developed by the World Bank.
Break that down for me. What exactly goes into the HCI? How do you mathematically score human potential?
The HCI calculates the amount of human capital that a child born today can expect to attain by age 18, given the risks of poor health and poor education that prevail in the country where they live.
Okay.
It combines survival rates, quality-adjusted years of schooling, and health environments. It's measured on a scale from 0 to 1.
Simple enough.
A score of 1 means a child can expect to achieve complete 100% of their potential productivity.
Meaning they receive full health, full nutrition, and a world-class education. The absolute ideal baseline of a fully realized human being in the workforce.
Exactly. So, where do you think Peru sits on that scale?
Well, with all that money, you'd hope it's high. Where is it?
The needle is stuck right around 0.60.
0.60. So let me make sure I'm understanding the implication here. That implies that 40% of a child's future baseline productivity is entirely wasted.
It is gone. It means that despite surviving childhood and despite having electricity at home, a child born in Peru today will only be 60% as productive when they grow up as they could have been if they had enjoyed complete education and full health.
That is wild.
40% of an entire generation's economic potential is just vaporizing before they even hit the labor market.
That is an astonishing amount of macroeconomic waste. It's like running a factory where 40% of the raw materials are just thrown in the incinerator every morning.
It really is.
And if we want to see exactly where that waste is happening, we have to look at the education data. And this is where the data gets genuinely shocking, because we see two seemingly contradictory facts sitting right next to each other.
What's fascinating here is the illusion of access versus the reality of learning.
Right. Because on one hand, the primary school gross enrollment rate is over 100%.
Which sounds great.
Hold on, I have to stop myself there. How do you get an enrollment rate over 100%? That mathematically sounds like a typo.
It does sound counterintuitive, but it happens when you have a system trying to catch up. Gross enrollment measures the total number of students enrolled in primary school, regardless of their age, expressed as a percentage of the official primary school age population.
Oh, I see.
So if you have older kids who started late or kids who are repeating grades because they failed previously, they are sitting in those primary classrooms too. Hence, you breach the 100% mark.
Okay, that makes sense. So basically, practically every single kid of primary school age, and even some older kids, is physically sitting in a classroom. The access problem, the physical infrastructure problem seems solved. The hardware is there.
But then you look at the other side of the ledger, the learning poverty rate.
And this is defined as the percentage of late primary age children. So we're talking about 10-year-olds who cannot read and understand a simple text.
And what is that number?
It is 44.4%.
That is the crux of the paradox. For a long time, the global development community measured success by looking at enrollment. If the kids are in the building, the policy is working.
Flags, right?
Exactly. But physical enrollment does not equal cognitive learning. We are seeing a substantive failure of the education system itself. The state built the classrooms, they put roofs over the students' heads, but they failed to fill those classrooms with effective pedagogy.
It's essentially like having a 100% attendance record at the gym, but never actually lifting a weight.
That is a brutally accurate way to visualize it.
You're physically in the building, you swiped your membership card, the lights are on, you're wearing your workout gear, but zero muscle growth is happening. You were just standing there on the floor while your potential atrophies.
You are present, but you are not developing. And the tragedy here goes beyond just wasting time. These children are spending the most neuroplastic years of their lives, the window where their brains are most capable of absorbing complex logic, language skills, and critical thinking in environments that are fundamentally not stimulating their cognitive growth.
But why? If they're in the building and the government has all this commodity wealth, why aren't they learning? Which brings us to the third phase, the stolen future.
Yes, the child labor and environmental tools.
Because having established that the children aren't learning, we have to transition into exploring why they aren't learning. And looking at the data, it's clearly not just a poorly designed textbook or lack of chalk.
No, it's much deeper than that.
It is massive, systemic, economic, and environmental pressures that are physically pulling their minds and bodies away from cognitive development.
This is where we confront the grim structural disease underneath those glowing GDP numbers. We have to look at the labor participation rate for children.
Let's look at it.
In Peru, the labor participation rate for children between the ages of 7 and 14 remains shockingly high, hovering between 20% to 26%.
Think about what you were doing at age 7 or 10. Between 7 and 14, that is when a child should be mastering reading comprehension, figuring out basic algebra, learning how to socialize.
Instead, every fourth or fifth child in this demographic is in the labor force.
Yeah, and we need to look at exactly where they are working. The data shows that over 62.6% of these child laborers are trapped in the agricultural sector.
This is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, a bit counterintuitive for anyone analyzing emerging markets.
So.
Well, the standard assumption is that economic booms eradicate child labor. The traditional narrative goes like this. A country gets richer, families make more money, they don't need their kids to work anymore just to survive, so they pull them out of the fields and send them to school to get a better life.
So why did Peru's specific economic boom seem to institutionalize child labor in agriculture rather than eradicate it?
To understand that, you have to unpack the specific microeconomics of commodity-driven growth. When an economy booms primarily because of raw material extraction like mining and the accompanying surge in agricultural exports, the immediate demand for low-skill manual labor spikes dramatically.
Because it's not a tech boom.
Right. This isn't a tech boom creating software engineering jobs. This is a resource boom demanding physical bodies to extract value from the earth.
The fields need to be harvested right now to meet global demand. The supply chains need to move immediately.
Exactly. So put yourself in the shoes of an impoverished family living in a rural area. You look at the local public school, which we've already established, is completely failing to teach your kids anything useful.
They're sitting there not learning to read.
And then you look at the booming agricultural sector right outside your door, which is suddenly offering immediate cash wages because of high global commodity prices. The economic incentive structure becomes entirely perverse.
It's a rational, albeit tragic, choice.
It is entirely rational from a survival standpoint. It makes short-term financial sense for a desperately poor family to pull their child's attention or their physical presence out of a failing institution and put them into the fields where they can generate immediate, desperately needed income.
So the boom doesn't rescue them.
No, the boom actively drafts them into the manual labor force.
Wow. The boom actively drafts them. The wealth itself becomes the magnet pulling them away from education. And it's not just the physical labor that's taxing their development. We also have to look at the environmental toll.
The rough, unbridled economic growth has a very dark, invisible side that directly impacts human capital.
Yeah, the environmental data is deeply concerning. The metrics show that practically 100% of the population is exposed to PM 2.5 air pollution that exceeds World Health Organization guidelines.
PM 2.5, for those who might not know, refers to particulate matter that is 2.5 micrometers or smaller.
It's incredibly tiny. It's so small it bypasses your body's normal defenses, gets deep into your lungs, and can even enter your bloodstream.
And alongside this universal exposure to dangerous particulate matter, we see rising CO2 emissions heavily driven by the industrial and transport sectors.
Which are the very engines powering this commodity boom.
Exactly.
So what the data is suggesting is that this economic miracle is acting as a silent biological tax. The wealth generation is literally poisoning the air. And we know from countless pediatric and medical studies that heavy exposure to PM 2.5 directly impacts early childhood brain development, respiratory health, and physical stamina.
The compounded effect is devastating. If a child is working part-time in the fields doing manual labor, breathing highly polluted air from nearby industrial transport, and then going to a school with no effective teaching methods.
Their human capital index doesn't stand a chance.
Right. The environment and the macroeconomy are essentially conspiring to lower their cognitive ceiling.
Which logically forces us to ask, where's all this money going?
That's the core of the fourth phase.
If the macroeconomy is booming, if the national GDP is doubling, why are these rural families still so financially precarious that they feel forced to send their 10-year-olds into the fields? How did this massive tidal wave of wealth fail to reach the ground floor?
This brings us to the mechanics of financial exclusion and wealth distribution. To understand why the families are still poor despite a rich national economy, we have to look at how money actually moves or fails to move through the society.
Let's look at financial account ownership. Overall, the percentage of adults with a formal financial account has risen to about 57.5%.
Okay, so more than half the country is officially in the banking system. At first glance, that looks like progress.
It looks like progress until you disaggregate the data by class.
Oh, right.
When you separate the richest 60% of the population from the poorest 40%, a massive chasm appears. There is an over 24 percentage point gap in account ownership between those two groups. The poorest demographic is structurally locked out of the formal financial system.
Let's explore what that actually means on a Tuesday morning for a family. Not having a bank account isn't just about not having a debit card.
It means you have no safe place to store savings.
And it means you have absolutely no access to formal credit. And without credit, economic mobility is almost impossible.
Right. You can't get a loan to start a small business. You can't get an agricultural loan to buy better seeds or a tractor. And crucially, you have no shock absorbers.
What do you mean by shock absorbers?
If there is a bad harvest or a medical emergency, you don't have a line of credit to float you through the hard times. You have to liquidate whatever assets you have, or, connecting back to our previous point, you have to pull your kid out of school to generate cash.
The lack of financial inclusion makes them incredibly vulnerable to volatility. And the income distribution data paints an even bleaker picture.
Oh, the income share data is staggering.
If you look at the income share by demographic quintile, the numbers are stagnant. The income share of the bottom 20% of the population, the poorest fifth of the entire country, has completely flatlined over this entire period of explosive GDP growth.
Wait, so the national pie got twice as big, but their slice didn't change at all.
Their share of the national wealth hovers eternally around a mere 4% to 5%. Despite the commodity boom, despite the mining exports, the rising tide did not lift their boats.
It just flooded their docks.
Precisely. The wealth accumulated almost entirely in the upper and middle deciles.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, especially if you are analyzing global markets? If you're an international investor, a brand manager, or a corporate strategist looking at expanding into emerging Latin American markets, you're usually looking for a rising middle class.
You're looking for a story of consumer growth.
Exactly. But how can a country sustain a modern consumer-driven economy if the bottom 20% are mathematically locked out of the financial system and their income share is entirely stagnant?
The short answer is they cannot. It is an incredibly fragile growth model. It relies entirely on external demand for raw materials rather than internal domestic consumption.
And the government is aware of this poverty, of course.
They attempted to fix it, but their solution just highlights the deeper dysfunction. We have to look at the social safety net.
This is where the policy choices get really interesting. Because on paper, the Peruvian safety net looks incredible.
If you just look at the coverage rate, it is a masterclass in reach. The safety net covers over 95% of the poorest populations.
Almost everyone living in structural poverty is technically receiving some kind of state assistance or is enrolled in a welfare program. That sounds like a massive win for public policy. If 95% of the vulnerable population is covered, you'd think the safety net is doing its job.
But that is a massive illusion created by looking at only one axis of the data. Because while the coverage is 95%, we also have to track the adequacy of the safety net.
Adequacy is defined as the percentage that these state transfers contribute to the total welfare or total necessary income of the beneficiary household.
So how much of their survival budget is actually being met by the government check?
Exactly. And that adequacy rate has plummeted from its historical highs down to less than 10%.
Less than 10%.
Okay, I want to use an analogy to really cement how this works. It's essentially a peanut butter approach to welfare.
Walk me through the peanut butter approach.
So imagine the state has one single jar of peanut butter. That jar represents the entire welfare budget.
Okay.
Now, the logical thing to do if you have a group of truly starving people is to make a few hearty, highly nutritious sandwiches and give them to the people who need them the absolute most.
Right, to actually pull them out of starvation.
Exactly. But instead, the government decided to take that one jar and spread it incredibly razor thin over a piece of bread the size of a football field.
Oh.
Yeah, they just scrape the knife across the bread so they can technically say, look, 95% of the bread is covered in peanut butter.
That is exactly what the data shows. I mean, the government prioritized width over depth. Spreading resources that thinly across the population creates, well, fantastic political optics.
The politicians can stand on a podium during an election year and say, we have successfully provided social assistance to 95% of our vulnerable citizens.
Which looks great on a campaign flyer.
But because the actual financial adequacy is less than 10% of what a family needs to actually survive, it fails to lift a single family out of the structural poverty trap.
It is enough money to get your name onto a government spreadsheet, but it is not nearly enough money to stop a desperate father from sending his 10-year-old son to work in the agricultural fields. The safety net is an optical illusion.
That is devastating. Every single failure we've discussed so far, the schools that don't teach, the unchecked air pollution, the total lack of financial inclusion, the inefficient peanut butter welfare programs, they don't just happen by accident.
No, they don't.
They all require a central explanation. Someone or some system is making these poor allocative decisions, which transitions us to the final phase of our deep dive, the governance landslide and the middle income trap.
This is the root cause. If we go back to your medical x-ray analogy, this is where the scan finally reveals the underlying tumor that is causing all the other symptoms. We have to look at the institutional metrics.
What are we looking at specifically?
The World Bank tracks percentile rankings for things like government effectiveness and control of corruption. And over the same period that GDP was soaring, the trajectories for governance are a steep, sustained slide downward.
They're going in the exact opposite direction.
Yes. Control of corruption in recent data has dropped to a dismal 25.4th percentile globally.
Just to clarify that percentile ranking, that means out of 100 countries, roughly 75 of them are doing an objectively better job at stopping corruption and graft than Peru is.
Precisely. The institutional defenses have essentially collapsed, and this pulls all the seemingly disparate data points we've discussed into a singular logical loop. Economists refer to this dynamic as the middle-income human capital trap.
How does the trap actually work?
It works in phases. A developing country relies on a natural resource dividend, like a global boom in copper prices, and smart, basic macroeconomic policy to wipe out absolute desperate poverty and build basic physical infrastructure. That is phase one. And comparatively, that is the easy part.
Right. Laying the electrical cables, buying the vaccines, paving the main highways. That is the hardware. It just requires a checkbook and basic engineering.
But phase two is where the trap snaps shut. To go further, to build high-quality education systems that teach critical thinking, to ensure deep financial equity, to design complex, effective social security programs that actually lift people out of poverty, that requires clean, highly effective, transparent governance.
It requires institutions that can manage complex systems over decades without the money disappearing.
Exactly. And without that institutional integrity, the country completely stalls.
It makes me think of the national economy as a leaky bucket. You can pour endless commodity-driven GDP into the top of the bucket, but institutional corruption, cronyism, and political resource misallocation are acting as massive holes in the bottom.
And so what happens to the water?
The actual usable human capital, the educated, capable, healthy workforce that a nation absolutely needs to compete in the next century, never actually accumulates. The water just drains out into the dirt.
That is exactly the mechanism of the trap. Corruption and institutional decay act as a direct, continuous leakage of the economic dividend.
When institutions fail, policies cannot make the evolutionary leap from resource-driven scale expansion to human capital-driven interdevelopment.
To fix that 44.4% learning poverty rate we talked about at the very beginning, the state cannot just build more physical school buildings. They already did that. The enrollment is over 100%.
To fix the reading deficit, the state must first fix its transparency, its anti-corruption mechanisms, and its ability to deliver high-quality pedagogical training without the funds being siphoned off by political patronage networks.
Which brings us to our synthesis and the final takeaway.
We started this deep dive with a mind-bending paradox. Shiny economic metrics and world-class physical infrastructure hiding a severe, crippling deficit in human capability and institutional integrity.
But having unpacked the macroeconomic hardware, the educational software, the perverse incentives of child labor, and the illusion of the safety net, the paradox is actually solved.
It is entirely legible once you look at the systemic flow of resources. The wealth was indeed generated, but it was structurally misallocated by failing institutions.
It was trapped in the upper echelons of the society, and the small amount that did trickle down was spread too thinly to create real, sustainable human development.
And whether you're evaluating emerging markets for an international investment portfolio, leading a corporate restructuring where you're looking at labor pools, or analyzing social policies in your own local community, the lesson here is universal and brutally clear.
You absolutely cannot buy your way out of a software problem using only hardware solutions.
You can buy 1 million laptops for rural schools, you can build beautiful brick classrooms, but you cannot buy the critical thinking required to utilize them without doing the hard, invisible, often politically dangerous work of institutional reform.
Which leaves us with a critical, final thought to consider. Our entire analysis today has been based on an era of unprecedented wealth generation fueled by global commodity demand.
Peru had the money to mask its structural failures.
Consider what happens to this economy, or any similarly structured economy globally, when the global appetite for their raw commodities inevitably slows down.
If the wealth of the ground runs dry before the wealth of the mind is cultivated, does the society simply stagnate? Or does it risk an unprecedented economic and social unraveling? Because suddenly, without that commodity cash flow acting as a buffer, that clean economic X-ray isn't just murky anymore. It's showing a fragile system that might completely lack the human capital to heal itself when the real stress test begins. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the data, look past the top line numbers, and we will catch you next time.